What's going on, everybody? It's RoarYG here, coming at you with a brand new video. And so, as per usual, it is the start of a brand new month, and so what better way to start it off than one of our typical standard YouTuber tier lists. So we're now entering June out of our May season, and May actually brought a lot of really great things and really crazy things for the game. So basically, we not only got a new ban list, which brought back some really funny cards, as well as hitting some stuff that I honestly feel like really needed to go. Verte. It also gave us Dimension Force, the most recent core set of the game, which introduced a lot of really hype cards to the metagame. And of course, as you probably know, YCS Hartford, which is going to be a sort of baseline for the tier list that we're going to do right now, but it's also going to be a sort of projection into the future, as you may call it, because I am going to be kind of like overshooting a little bit of things, because remember, we are still in a little bit of a shakeup due to the ban list as well as the release of Dimension Force, and so it's going to be a bit tricky, but I think things will settle out in a pretty standard way over time. I do apologize in advance for my webcam quality, by the way. No, the white balance is not off a lot. It's just my face is really red. I just got back from a graduation pool party at my friend's house. It was great. And I got a little bit burnt because I am now finally out of high school, and so I'll have a lot more time to dedicate to videos, preferably. And so you can go ahead and keep that in mind. But without further ado, I want to go ahead and get right into my competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier list for June 2022. So starting off, we're going to get the elephant out of the room. We have Sky Striker, and we're all just going to agree we're not going to call the monstrosity that won Hartford Sky Striker, right? We're calling that Mystic Mind Turbo? Cool. Cool. Jokes aside, I actually don't want to put Sky Striker higher than a 1.5 right now, and the only reason that's keeping me from putting it in tier 2 is the introduction of Therian's King Regulus, which I think is a really good and funny card for Sky Striker, because keep in mind, Fusion Destiny is still at 2, and we just got Verte Anaconda banned, meaning that the deck is going to have a lot harder of a time playing something like Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer without playing a bunch of bricks. And so instead of playing Phoenix Enforcer, they can actually play Therian's King Regulus, which just released in Dimension Force with the Therian's archetype, because Therian's Regulus allows you to equip a machine from grave to special summon it, and it's a free negate for the deck, which, yeah, the deck has a lot of imperm style negates, but it doesn't really have any sort of actual quote-unquote negates. And because it does remove itself from the field in order to do so, you're going to have your field cleared up for all of your Sky Striker stuff, and I'm pretty sure if you use the Argyro system, you're not only going to be getting some spells in your grave, but also you can loop the Regulus, and so I haven't really seen any use of it so far, at least in terms of lists. I'm sort of just hypothesizing that. I think it could be a really great splash in for the deck, and so I am going to keep it at 1.5, and yes, it actually did get 3 tops at Hartford. I don't know how many of them actually were Mystic Mind Turbo. I think it was really just the winning deck list that did it, but it's like, come on, 3 Demise of the Land, Terraforming Metaverse, and 3 copies of Mystic Mind. That's just disgusting gameplay right there. Yeah, so Sky Striker, while it did win the event, I don't want to put it higher than a 1.5, and I really want to see what it can do with the Therian stuff, because maybe it'll make it a little bit more interesting for me. Next up, we have Dinosaur. Of course, I'm going to have to keep it in Rogue. Misk is still at 1. We unfortunately did not see it come back to 2 or 3 on the last Forbidden Unlimited list in May. Come on, man, please. So unfortunately right now, it is still stuck as a really mediocre going first combo deck if you want to play it like that, even with Jet Synchron back allowing for some funny synchro plays, or a really underwhelming going second OTK deck, because it really can't afford to use something like Droplet because all of its combos are 2 cards. And if you play something like Dark Ruler, well, you can't kill, and a lot of decks have insane follow-up in this current metagame, and so it's sort of stuck in a really bad limbo where it's a super, like, average mid-tier deck. And so I'm going to be keeping it in Rogue still, because as long as Misk is at 1, we're probably going to not be in a good time as a Dinosaur player. Next up, we have Invoked, which I'm actually going to count as including the Dogmatica and Shadal stuff, but also including the branded package. I'm going to be putting this just below Sky Striker, or in the top of tier 2, one of the two. I'm going to put it in high tier 2. I think that Dogmatica Invoke branded Shadal is a really good deck. I do have a list up in the top right corner, as always in the annotation, of a deck list for Dogmatica Invoke branded Shadal, which I think is really good, because the thing is, Mirror Jade is a lot stronger of an end board piece than Mechaba, but if you can end off on both, it's really strong. You're essentially going to be sitting on several disruptions or Winda or Kaliga, maybe even both, with a few hand traps as well. So you're basically going to be slowing your opponent down, and then every turn you're going to be able to recur your Alistair, and you might actually be able to recur your branded stuff a lot with things like Albion and Spriggan's Kit. Invoke unfortunately did not see any top cut representation in Hartford. However, I don't think that stops the deck from being a really good choice if you want to play the branded engine. I think it's a really good deck in terms of its simplicity as well as its ability to have a really high skill ceiling while also being fairly easy to pilot. Mirror Jade Kaliga is still a really strong lock, people. It's genuinely a really simple spell, but hard to break. So yeah, I think it's a really good use of the branded package if you don't want to play something like Despia, which we're about to get into, or, you know, Protoplant with Protoplant going up to around $75 to $100. And Winda is, of course, still a strong floodgate as always. Next up, we have Despia, of course. That is going to be our first tier 1 deck. Despia is still absolutely really good right now. Even though it has been solved, quote unquote, it's kind of at its peak in terms of skill ceiling until maybe, you know, some new cards come out, which I don't think anything's coming out anytime soon that could help the deck. But it's a really strong contender for our tier 1 spot, simply because of how much follow-up the deck can do. It excels in the grind game as long as it doesn't burn through its fusions too fast. So even while it does have a mediocre end board in terms of, like, you know, maybe branded in red and Mirror Jade Pass, things like Dramaturge and Ad Libitum as well as branded opening allow the deck to just keep grinding and chipping away at the opponent, especially with things like Masquerade being able to chip away at the life points. And of course, Super Poly is still a legal card at 3, and so Despia is of course in a really good spot, especially because it didn't receive any sort of hits on the last Forbidden and Limited list. It also just received Alba Lenitus in the last set Dimension Force, which allows it to not only curb stomp Dragon Link players, but also allows them to recur more things like Branded Fusion, as well as other things they may be able to fusion someone with in case they, you know, want to play something else. They can even grab the Polymerization in case the Patchwork engine doesn't work out, I don't know. Yeah, Despia is likely going to be staying in the tier 1 spot for quite a while until the December ban list, and so don't expect this to change anytime soon. So next up we have Protoplant, and I'm actually going to put Protoplant in the tier 2 category like I have been, however for even more reason to not put it in Rogue, because ignoring the price of Protoplant right now, branded Protoplant is actually a pretty good deck, and it still has access to the DPE package if it really wants to, in the form of Darlingtonia Cobra, being able to search it at any point in time as long as you summon it off of something like Orpheus Scorpio. It's a deck that excels at using things like Super Poly and abusing them, while also of course being able to use the branded package to net them advantage off of things like Protoplant Biblisp, and also being able to end off on something like Mirror Jade and then get the recursion follow-up with Albion. It's actually a really simple combo deck as well, with a bunch of different card combinations allowing you to get access to your typical end board, which I can't really speak on anymore. However, it can still end up being something like, you know, Super Poly into Trifo with both the Pendulum Scale set, as well as Dragostapelia, which keep in mind is not just an imperm but a skill drain, and then instead of DPE now you can end off on the Mirror Jade, which gets you again more advantage to make your combo even easier. The loss of Protoplant Verte Anaconda did not hurt the deck in the slightest. In fact, it was an afterthought in the deck, sort of like a plan B in case your stuff gets hand-trapped. However, being able to search guaranteed off of Biblisp instead of just, you know, sometimes, actually kind of makes up for it entirely. I think Protoplant is a really fun tier 2 option. I think it's great if you want to put your branded package to good use if you just wait a month, because I don't think buying Protoplant right now is a good idea at all. But we are getting a reprint in the next Legendary Duelist, I believe it is, and so keep an eye out for that in case you're really interested in playing it. Next up, we have Adagnister, and I'm actually going to be putting Adagnister above Dinosaur compared to usual, and here's why. So, not only did it see top cut success at YCS Hartford, it's also in a really good spot right now, specifically because a lot of decks aren't playing a mass amount of hand traps. Things like Despia and Sword Soul 10, you would actually much rather play things that allow them to continue playing their combos, and so in exchange for hand traps, they're playing Gas, which is a format that Adagnister actually excels in. Because the thing is, Adagnister is really good at summoning its towers if it doesn't get hand trapped. And so if it's not getting hand trapped, it's summoning its towers, and a lot of decks actually don't have an out to the towers. Things like Despia and Sword Soul are actually completely unable to access something like Access Code, which is kind of one of the only outs to the towers other than Boral Sword, which again neither of them can actually play, because they do lock each other into certain things or would rather play something else. And so Adagnister is sort of in this really good spot, whereas towers is actually a really good end piece, as well as being able to easily access it compared to, you know, past formats. So for once, I'm actually going to be putting it above Dinosaur in the Rogue category, but I don't really think it should go any higher than that for now. Next up, we have Punk, and I'm a bit iffy on this because a lot of the Punk builds are sort of just, you know, adventurer pile, but with a lot of Punk cards, and people still don't understand how to play against the deck a lot in terms of its combos, and so I'm going to be keeping it at... I'm going to put it at the top of tier 2, because yes, it did receive something along the lines of 7 tops at YCS Hartford in top 32, but I don't think that warrants putting it any higher than tier 2, because again, people really don't understand how the deck works. It's mainly an adventure pile deck, but it also has access to the punk stuff, which is a really good engine in terms of making not only level 8 synchros, but also going into Hulk plays. Dimension Force did give them Punk Deer Note, I believe it's called, which is how it's facilitating its level 8 synchro engine, which I think is really strong. But again, at the end of the day, it is sort of a mashup pile adventure nonsense deck, and so people will eventually find a way to play against it, which is why a lot of the pile decks aren't doing so hot anymore. Especially without something like a Roarodon, which the Punk engine excelled in making, it's eventually going to be solved and cracked down upon, and it's overall not going to do as good as it was before. Maybe in Power of the Elements when it gets its new stuff, like its new level 8 synchro and the field spell and stuff, it'll probably do a lot better then. However, for now, I think while it is doing very good, I don't think it's going to be keeping that way for very long. Next up, we have Sword Switch. I'm actually going to be putting above Despia, and that's because yes, it did lose a Roarodon, which is more hits than Despia actually received, but it did get a second copy of Desires back, and the deck is still really strong in what it can do. A lot of typical hands can actually net you 3 synchros and a blackout, which is more than Despia can usually say for its end board, and it's overall still a really good deck, while also having really good outs to other decks, with things like Vishuda being able to bounce, which is super strong in terms of removal. And keep in mind that Cheng Ying is still a hell of a card. It saw the same amount of tops as Punk at Hartford, tying for the most with 7. It managed to crack into top 4 as per usual, along with branded Despia, Drytron, and Sky Striker. And while it didn't take the event, I still want to say that it is the best deck of the format, and of course the deck to beat overall. Next up we have Drytron, and while it did get into top 4 at Hartford, I still don't think that's grounds to put it any higher than a tier 2 currently. In fact, I'm actually going to put it under Punk in terms of both what Punk is doing and how Drytron actually plays, because keep in mind that Drytron is actually full of 2-card combos, and the main reason that's probably seeing success right now is because the cut down on hand traps and a lot of the top strategies, because 2-card combos are in a sort of really awkward spot right now. If your deck isn't playing 1-card combos or 1.5-card combos, it's not really doing too hot, because you want to facilitate having as much gas as possible, and with the less cards that you have to expend, the less gas you actually have to use in order to do your combos. Overall, Drytron's still a really strong deck. I think the Megalith build is still the strongest one you can play. Being able to pop a bunch of cards with Bethor is absolutely nuts, but it's far past its glory days in terms of what it can do in terms of its end board, and so I am going to be keeping it in the tier 2 category for now. Next up we have Tri-Brigade variants, and it pains me to say this, but Tri-Brigade variants are going to be sticking in the tier 2 category. I'm going to be putting it above Invoke but below Drytron currently, and it didn't see any sort of tops in top 32 at YCS Hartford, unfortunately, and it feels like that the banning of Protoplant, Verte, and Anaconda sort of snuffed out any flame that this deck may have had with the branded package and just summoning DPE overall. And while I think decks like Bird Up are still really strong and super slept on for no real reason in my opinion, I think that without seeing any sort of top cut success against the other meta decks right now, it's just not going to be going too high on a tier list like this. Maybe when Power of the Elements comes out and we get the new Melfi support, it'll do better then, but for now I'm going to have to keep it in the tier 2 category. Next up we have Eldritch, and I'm going to be putting Eldritch under Despia in tier 1. I think that these 3 are the current decks to beat along with just the piles, because Eldritch has been seeing a lot of success both as a pile and kind of pure almost. Keep in mind that cards like Skill Drain are still at 3, and now can play funny things like Change of Heart if it really wants to take a really problematic monster that Eldritch can't get over for some reason. And there's all sorts of good stuff traps that can completely screw over a lot of decks. It also almost completely ignores the effect of Mirror Jade during the end phase, and in fact it might actually plus off of it, because if you're summoning your Conquistador and Haquero and they get nuked, congratulations, you just gave them free Scarlet Sanguines. I think Eldritch is super strong right now. You can play a bunch of different builds. I think Synchro Lich is starting to make a slight comeback, and by that I mean Hulk into Scythe Lock, because TG Wonder Magician is still a card, and so people are just Scythe Locking with Hulk instead of going into Verte. So these 3 overall I think are the decks to beat this format, and I don't think they're going to be top pulling for now. Maybe we'll see in further events after some stuff goes on. Next up we have Flunderies, and I'm actually going to put Flunder above Sky Striker in the tier 1.5 category. Flunder is doing absolutely incredible right now. It received basically no hits at all on the last Forbidden and Limited list, and overall it's just doing really steady in terms of competitive success. It received around 3 tops at YCS Hartford, and its game plan hasn't really changed since Battle of Chaos, usually being a barrier statue and Dimension Shifter stun, with Empen of course being on field as well, which can screw over a lot of different decks. For the few hand traps that decks are currently playing, at least in terms of the top decks, they can avoid them with things like Advent of Adventure, and so it's in a really nice spot for both going first and actually being able to go second, with of course things like Change of Heart, allowing you to take your opponent's monsters, and you can actually tribute them off for your larger bodies if you're not playing the continuous spell. I think Thunder is a nice 1.5 category deck, and if you want to get about average tournament results and you want to keep rocking steady with the meta, go ahead and pick Thunder up if you're in for a little bit of a snooze fest. Next up, we have Earth Machine. Next up, we have Virtual World, and I really want to put Virtual World higher, man, but this deck is just kind of garbage right now. So yes, it did get access to the Adventure engine, and yes, it can also use a Punk engine. However, it cannot abuse the really good part of Punk being able to make level 8 synchros now, and going into Hulk, because it can't go into Lynx, and it doesn't use level 8 synchros. It can still use the Punk engine for level 6 stuff, of course. Things like the Stardust Charge Warrior are really nice to go into, with the Xiamen and the Foxy Tune being able to summon a non-tuner Punk. And the Adventurer package is still really nice for setting up a negate. However, it just requires way too many cards to actually get the deck chugging along in a format with 1.5 card combos sort of ruling the meta, and it doesn't help that you're just negging so many resources for a painfully average board. With the Adventure package, you're ending on roughly an Omni Negate, a Pseudo Macro Cosmos, and a Monster Negate, with a Chuchi in the back row, which isn't bad, don't get me wrong, but you have to neg so much cards in your hands in order to do that, with very little follow-up aside from the Lulu, and you have to draw super specific in order to make an end board like that. So yeah, I love Virtual World overall as a deck, but it's just way too clunky and bricky and slow right now, and so it's going to be in a lower part of tier 2. Next up, we have Prank Kids, guys, and guys, I'm gonna put Prank Kids at the bottom of Rogue. Prank Kids saw absolutely no topping success at the YCS, and I'm pretty sure it's because people aren't really playing it, and I don't blame them. Not only did they lose Meow Meow, of course, which is one of the strongest hits I've seen to a deck in a while, but with Verte being gone, they also lost their easy access to DPE, both of which were really necessary for the deck to play properly. And so now you're basically playing Adventure Polymerization Turbo, and you're just not going to have a good time if you're trying to play Prank Kids right now against sort of any deck in the current format. See, it's honestly about time in my opinion, because I really don't think Prank Kids needed to be as good as long as it was. And so overall, rip Bozo. Next up, we have Phantom Knights. I'm going to put Phantom Knights above Tri-Brigade but below Drytron. I know we have a lot of tier 2. You can probably flex this up into 1.5 if you really feel like it, but I don't know. But Phantom Knights has also not been doing all too hot. It's sort of like what I said in my last few tier lists, where it's kind of just a bad build of Scythe Lock, but now without the ability to go into Scythe super easily with Verte, it kind of has very little going for it. You can make the argument that it can do something like Dark Requiem Siege Dragon now, instead of going for, like, you know, the double Fog Blade DPE Scythe Lock, but I don't really think that's too crazy, and because it can't really access Scythe Lock that easily unless it goes for E-Telly, obviously, I don't think that it warrants playing it over any other sort of, like, adventure pile deck if you can. So yeah, Phantom Knights, I'm going to be sticking you in the tier 2 category. I might be actually being a little bit too generous right now, but I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and maybe just say that it hasn't been solved for this current format yet. Next up, we have Dynamorphia, and unfortunately, Dynamorphia hasn't been doing too crazy outside of being an engine, and so I'm going to be putting it above Dinosaur in the Rogue category. I do think it's a really strong deck, but it has so many weaknesses right now that can actually be easily fixed. Personally, I think the deck can be really good if it gets a third main deck monster, similar to how Unchained Twins had the 2, but then gained a third over time for the Twins set. And I think maybe then the deck will be a little bit better, but having only the 2 monsters is both a blessing and a curse, because yeah, if you draw too many monsters, you're completely screwed, but if you don't draw any monsters, you're also probably not in a good situation. Rexdrum is a very strong card, but with things like Tenyi Spirit Vashuda running around, you're not going to get too far, especially with things like Super Poly as well. That's going to become a Dragostapelia in no time. Next up, we have Dragon Link, and I'm going to be nice and put Dragon Link at the bottom of 1.5. It did receive a top in top 32, but keep in mind, guys, that Dragon Link has the worst branded matchup possible. All a deck running Albaz has to do is set him face down, and there is literally nothing the Dragon Link player can do about it until their stuff is contact fused away in the blink of an eye. However, it still has a pretty good matchup against a lot of other decks of the format, and it's still a good adventurer pile deck. It did lose access to the DPE for the builds that did play it, but it can always use some other package if it really wants to, because it has so many different things that it can run. You're still ending off on a decent end board in a format where people aren't playing too many board breakers, and so yeah, Dragon Link is still perfectly fine. Dragon Link players just have to be wary in case they go up in the Despia matchup, because they're not going to be in for a very good time at all. Next up, we have Salamangrape, and it did get their stuff off the list almost completely free, aside from Gazelle still being at 1. However, I'm going to have to keep it in the Rogue category. I'll put it above Dinosaur to give it the benefit of the doubt, but I don't think it's going to be doing too great. They also got access to Decode Talker Heat Soul and Ghost from the Past 2, which is a bit difficult for them to summon if they don't go into Splash Mage, which keep in mind, a lot of their stuff likes to lock them into fire, but I still don't think it's too great. In fact, I think the Heat Soul is actually kind of a nerf for the deck, because yeah, like 2 draws is pretty decent, a deck that likes to play a lot of hand traps, but you have to go into Splash Mage just to do that, because you can't make it natively with just fires. The end board of the deck is still really underwhelming as well, only ending off on, you know, maybe a few pops and a roar with some hand traps in hand, but it did get a big consistency boost from the last ban list, and so I will put it in the rogue category above a few of the other decks, but I do think it's not as good as something like Adagnister right now, which can kind of abuse Heat Soul a lot more. Next up, we have Pen Best Deck, baby, and I want to put Penned... I'll put it above Dynamorphia. I think Penned is in a really good spot. Of course, it doesn't have Electromite, but it still has access to all of the new goodies it got in Dimension Force. Not only did it get Beyond the Pendulum, which is kind of bonkers as a card, with a good restriction though, unlike something like Electromite, it also got access to a few other things, like Pendulum Graph Dragon, in case it wants to play a small Odd Eyes engine. And while Tuning Magician, Hulk plays are the better option to go for, it did also get access to Monk Keyboard for the different pen decks that you want to play, and so pen players are eating really good right now. Obligatory Pen Best deck aside, I think Pendulum is in a really good spot, with the only thing holding it back being Anti-Spell, still seeing a little bit of play for things like Droplet, but I think until Electromite comes back, there is no better time to play Pendulum than now. And speaking of Pendulum, our final deck of this tier list is going to be DDD. I've been leaving it on the past few lists, and for that I do apologize, but I would like to put it on this one, as it did see a top 32 slot outside of the victory I believe it got in a different event, and so I'm going to be putting it above Pendulum, but below Adagnister. DDD is in a great spot. The new support that it received in Battle of Chaos was really nice for the deck. Things like Deus Machinex are absolutely bonkers. I think the deck has a lot going for it. It has a lot of going first and second tools, especially outs to things like Mystic Mine, and in the variety of the lines that you're able to summon in the deck, I think it's really good at dodging the few hand traps people are playing as well. The only thing keeping me from putting it higher most likely is the fact that it requires a very skilled pilot for the most part, because there are so many lines and a very high skill ceiling, but I think DDD is a great deck, and if you really like Pendulum, I think DDD is a great deck to give a shot. But with that out of the way, that is going to do it for the tier list. Just to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, I will put Punk in the bottom of tier 1.5. Like I said, it is a little bit interchangeable, but I think this is a rather decent tier list for the June 2022 format. After the ban list and Dimension Force, we are still trying to solve the format a little bit, because while we did have the previous decks that we could kind of bounce off of, like Despia, it didn't see as much like, you know, dominant tier 0 success as people expected, and so it is really good to see that. I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in a super healthy state right now with things like Aurora on Inverte Band, because there's so much variety in the decks you can play. Look at this tier list. Look at all of the different decks that you can play, and this isn't even all the half of it. You could play so many different builds right now of different decks. Like, you could play Branded Eldritch if you really want to. The Branded package is also really balanced, because without Verte, you can't splash into a bunch of other decks like Fusion Destiny, which isn't seeing a lot of play anymore because of the bricks that you have to play without being able to access it guaranteed off of Verte, because Branded Fusion forces you into only summoning fusions, and so it's a very nice restriction on a really strong card. So while the prices are a little bit out of hand, I don't think there's a better time to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Than right now. So I think it's really cool if you want to get a friend into Yu-Gi-Oh! Right now if you have a spare deck to lend them, or even get them the branded structure decks right off the bat, because you'll already have a super strong deck. But with that being said, once again, that is going to be the tier list, and that is going to do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll put this video and the channel into YouTube recommended, and if you liked it and you want to see more content like it, like the rest of my tier list, I make one every month, and more awesome Yu-Gi-Oh! Content, then perhaps consider subscribing, because we're on our way to 1,500 subscribers, and now that I am out of high school, I am going to be able to dedicate a lot more time to the channel, and so I'll try to upload a lot more frequently. But once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.